If you will all stand as we recite Psalm 23 together, as we have done every week during the series, and as we encourage you in the beginning of the series to memorize portions or the entirety of this psalm. If that is true, recite this with your eyes closed as you recite it from memory. Let's recite this together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. You may be seated. So if you see a woman in green or blue scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck, you know who she is and what she does. Likewise, if a man comes into your house to fix something and he's got a hammer, a chisel, and a measuring tape on his tool belt around his waist, you know that he's there not to repair your laptop. Likewise, in Psalm 23, it teaches us in a beautiful way who Jesus is and what he does by what he holds in his hands. The shepherd's rod and staff are symbols of his sovereign rule and his gracious care. And David says that those two instruments bring immense comfort to him, and there's a distinction between the rod and the staff. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through a little bit of cultural historical analysis of what the rod, the staff, the table, and the oil is, and we're going to see a lot of relevance as it relates to our own Christian life. So let's dive in. We're going to begin with the rod. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This instrument was used for beating. Now that I have your attention, it's never for the flock, okay? Get that straight. The rod isn't to beat the sheep. God doesn't do that. The shepherd doesn't do that. It's to ward off predators. So it is the shepherd's primary offensive weapon to keep predators at bay from the flock. And so it's to protect them, whether it's wild animals or human thieves. Now the rod would have been an instrument about 2.5 feet long, like a short club, and made out of wood, and oftentimes at the very tip of it, there'd be pieces of metal and sharp rocks embedded at the tips, and so you could imagine that the rod was a very formidable weapon. In fact, David, he refers to the rod when he talks to King Saul right before he battles Goliath. He says this in 1 Samuel, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." So you can imagine David with that rod, probably with some sharp rocks at the end, striking the lion and killing it. So not only is the rod an instrument of aggression and offense, but the shepherd's rod was it's referenced in Leviticus chapter 27, where it is used, interestingly enough, as a counting device. In other words, the idea is that the sheep, they would re-enter the fold at the end of the day, and so the shepherd would hold out the rod right by the entrance into the gate, and so the sheep would walk under it, and that would be a way for the shepherd to keep count of all of his sheep. And so this was the shepherd's way of personally checking in on each sheep and making sure they were all present and accounted for. And so the shepherd's protection is not just an instrument of aggression, but it's also a symbol of loving care and possession, which is why John chapter 10, he says this, he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out, right? So God's ready willingness to protect us, his sheep, follows from the fact that he knows exactly who belongs to him. And his care goes down to the point where he knows us by name. And so this is really good news for us, that his rod of protection, it wards off enemies and predators, but also it symbolizes his care and the fact that we belong to him. Because some of us today come in and we feel weak and weary. Some of us, we feel pressed down and pretty broken by life. And what this is saying is that our good shepherd will put strength in your failing heart. Even as he reminds you that even though you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, he is with you, that he's going to lead you through that. And on the other side of the valley is where this psalm ends. You will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It means that he's protecting you, he is with you. And his rod is assurance of his presence and protection. And this is really good news. And for me, this point really came home alive to me when I thought back about my first encounter with Bruno. Now, Bruno is my friend's Great Dane. Not only Great Dane, but he is also part pit bull. And to this day, I've never seen another dog as large and as magnificent as Bruno. I mean, when he's standing in all four, he comes up like this high. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if he was like part horse, given his enormous size. Well, the irony about Bruno is, on one hand, with his master, he is completely unassuming, docile and unassuming. At the same time, with everybody else, it's almost like he is a threat to everybody else around him. I remember walking through downtown Chicago with Bruno and his master, and it is quite a sight, right? As he's walking downtown, like the crowds part, almost like the Red Sea, to make way for Bruno, right? And therefore make way for us. And it just felt awesome just to walk behind him and be like, man. And as Bruno passed by, you could see grown men, like big, athletic, strong men, like even putting their protective arms out in front of women and children as Bruno passed by. That's how much of a threat he was. My friend lives in a part of Chicago that is not known for its safety or low crime rates. And I remember sleeping over that night, and as I slept, Bruno lay a few feet away right by the front door. And as I was sleeping, I was awakened on a couple occasions by his deep-throated, like guttural, rumbling growl as people passed by on the other side of the door, completely unaware that there was this beast, this guardian beast, that should they want to intrude and walk through that door, right, they would have been met by him. And I remember drifting back to sleep, almost wishing that somebody would attempt a break-in, right? Because it would be a break-in that they would never forget. And that night, I had a shepherd, and I had no reason to fear. And so David is saying he has no less security in his shepherd, who he knows and speaks with directly and personally. And so therefore he says, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod is there to protect me. It will ward off the enemies, and I know that I belong to you. And so that is what this psalm says to us, that we have a good shepherd, and there are no enemies or no rivals that can go against God, where we will be snatched away from his hands. So that's a little bit about the rod. Let's go to the staff, because that's the other thing that a shepherd usually carries in his hand. And a staff that a shepherd carries is usually about 5 feet tall and has a crook at the end of it. Now, in fact, the shepherd's staff became an image in the ancient world in connection to rulers and to leaders. And so one example is King Tut, the ruler and pharaoh of all Egypt. He is often depicted with a flail on one hand and a crook, which is a shorter version of a shepherd's staff, on the other hand, which for him symbolized, and all throughout that time, his sovereign rule, his protection, and his care for his people. And so that's what a staff is. And so what was a staff used for? If the rod was an offensive weapon, what is a staff used for? On one hand, the staff was used by shepherds as a walking stick. If you've ever gone hiking somewhere and the land is unstable, you know you need a good walking stick. A few weeks ago, our family came back from the Zion National Park. One of the hikes is the Narrows, where you have to traverse through some water. You're surrounded by these tall, looming walls in this canyon, and you do not go through that hike without a walking stick, because your footing is very unsure depending on how high the water is. And so the shepherd would use the staff as a walking stick, especially as it traversed through mountains and passes because the footing was really unsure. But the reason why there is a crook at the end of the staff is it was used as an instrument of guidance and rescue. Two different reasons, right? So guidance, if a sheep were to wander off the path that the flock was walking in, the shepherd would use a long staff to reach out and to nudge the sheep back. Hey, don't get off the path. Come back here, and it would redirect the sheep onto the path. So it was an instrument of guidance, but it was also an instrument of rescue. In a more severe case, if a sheep fell in a ditch or even a canyon, the shepherd can reach down and with the crook of the staff, secure the sheep and bring it out and rescue it from danger. So David says that God's unwavering commitment to bring us back when we wander and to rescue us when we fall is what brings him enormous comfort. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now the word comfort here suggests not just God's presence and protection, but also his power to guide and rescue us. Now, I don't know about you. When I think about his staff and his rod, right, I want Jesus to protect me from my enemies with his rod. But I'm not so sure that I want Jesus to protect me from myself with his staff, right? We like the idea of Jesus coming down hard on others. We are less enamored with the idea of Jesus reaching down to us personally and directing us somewhere that we don't want to go. Or when we go off the path, him saying, no, that's not the way. And so when it comes to life, when you think about your great enemies in life, let me say this. Your greatest enemy in life is not your life situation. I know it may feel that way. Your greatest enemy in life is not your boss. It's not your parents. It's not your kids. It's not your coworkers. It's not your neighbors. Your greatest enemy in life is yourself. Because too often we fall under the delusion thinking that God's path of righteousness is not the same as our path of happiness. And so because we think that, because we believe that lie, we wander off the path, and the good shepherd has to reach out with his staff and bring us back in, and we graze in fields that we were never intended to graze. And so that's some of us. We've wandered off the path. We're involved in something that God is saying we know that we should never have gone there. Others of you who may have wandered off the path, you feel like you've wandered so far from home for so long that you feel like, man, God's shepherd staff, I'm way beyond his reach. And that's not true either, right? I will say this, because of his great love for you, he is coming after you. Not to punish you, right? He is coming after you to care for you, to protect you, and to bring you back into the fold. And so for some of you, I just want to say this. I think it's time to come home, to come back into the paths of righteousness, to receive God's nudging and his redirection and his rescue. It's time that maybe some of you step into a community group or get involved in a ministry team. Maybe others of you, you've been coming, but it's time to stop watching from a distance and really get connected and involved with the rest of the flock. So that's the two instruments he has in his hands: his rod to protect you as an offensive weapon, and his staff to nudge us and redirect us. But as you read on, it also talks about he prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. I used to have this image that God was going to somehow spread a big table, a banquet, a feast, and then he would have, and part of me kind of scratched my head like, okay, that's awesome, God, but why would you invite my enemies to the table, right? You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Some scholars believe that's the right imagery. Most scholars actually believe it's referring to something else. And now, since studying up on this, I agree with the latter, right? It actually refers to, when it talks about a table before you, right, preparing a table before you, it actually refers to a high, flat-topped plateau that in the ancient Near East was often known as tablelands. And there are still places in the world where they talk about tablelands, right? High, flat-top plateaus. They are remote and hard-to-reach places where in the summertime, it's like one of the only places that sheep can graze. Because in the lower valleys, the grass has turned brown, there's no pasture there, and so they have to go into these higher valleys, higher plateaus where they can find pasture. And so each year, the shepherd has to take time and trouble to go ahead and ready the land for the arrival of his flock. And so he prepares the tableland for his sheep, whether that's removing poisonous weeds or plants or whatever it is. And the parallel in the Christian life is this, that our good shepherd goes before us in every situation that you face. Everything that you encounter, he has gone before you and he's making provision for you. Doesn't mean that all your enemies are eliminated, right? And so the sheep would come into this tableland and they would be still surrounded by enemies all around them. And so that's why the shepherd would keep an alert eye because of possible enemies or predators that might attack. And so you imagine a flock of sheep coming into the tablelands where they are highly vulnerable. Right? It's just an open field, a plateau. And so it is always the sheep that are kind of out on the edges, the roamers, the wanderers who are out on their own, not with the flock, who get snatched up by the predators because they're easy targets. Likewise, our good shepherd neither slumbers nor sleeps, but keeps a vigilant eye on us, especially against the schemes of our enemy, which is Satan, who prowls and seeks and pursues to devour us. And so, like the sheep, it would also be wise for us to remain close to our good shepherd and to remain close to the flock in fellowship with the other believers, because then we are less likely to be snatched away by our enemy. So, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare the tableland before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. And again, I had this picture that because David, when he became king, was anointed by oil. So first I had this image of a feast. And then the next verse was kind of, okay, now after the feast is over, you're going to pour oil to anoint. Little did I know that actually shepherds anoint their sheep with oil. Now, there are 3 reasons why sheep receive an anointing of oil. 3 reasons. Bugs, butts, and cuts. Okay? Bugs, butts, and cuts. Let's go through them really quickly. First of all, bugs. Sheep are particularly prone to flies landing in their eyes, their ears, and especially their nose. And the flies travel up the sheep's nose and they lay eggs, which is just gross, right? And those eggs turn into worms that can burrow into the animal's brain, which then drives the sheep literally insane. One shepherd explains it this way. For relief from this agonizing annoyance, sheep will deliberately beat their heads against trees, rocks, posts, or brush. In extreme cases of intense infestation, a sheep may even kill itself in a frenzied endeavor to gain respite from the aggravation. And so, to keep bugs away and flies, right? When that happens, sheep can't eat, they don't sleep, and an entire flock can be disrupted and even destroyed by the presence of a few flies. And so for this reason, the shepherd anoints the sheep with oil. He covers their heads with this oil-like repellent, and because of that, the smell keeps the insects away, the bugs away, and it keeps the flock at peace. Well, sheep aren't the only ones that need preventative care. I don't know about you, but don't you have a swarm of daily irritations buzzing around your head? People who annoy you, right? They annoy you because of rude comments or inconsiderate actions. Maybe it's your parents, like, oh, they're so annoying, right? They're like little flies swirling around your head, right? Or maybe you're a parent, you're like, oh, kids are so frustrating, right? It's like they're laying larvae in my nose, I'm about to go insane, right? Or maybe it's a complete stranger. He said or did something that was just so inconsiderate. When it gets inside your head and burrows into your mind, it can literally drive you insane. Next thing you know, you find yourself not just irritable, but maybe even hurt or wounded. You don't eat, you can't sleep, and like sheep, you get so mad that it could drive you to a point where you just want to beat your head against a rock like repeatedly just to gain some respite, right? And so there's a lot of parallels here. And when that happens, when those closest to you wound you, I mean, that's where some of our deepest wounds in life come from, right? What happens is you can butt heads with other people. And so the first reason for oil was bugs. The second was butts. And I'm not talking about rear end butts, okay? I'm talking about when you headbutt with other people. There's enough pain and wounds. What happens is you get into conflicts with other people. And so shepherds will apply oil on rams, which now I know, I didn't know a few weeks ago, are male sheep, right? In order to prevent injury from them butting heads with each other, because during mating season, that's what they do. They puff themselves up, they lower their heads, and have an old-fashioned butting of heads with each other. And so what shepherds will do, they will smear this slippery, oil-like, greasy substance on their head, and it functions as a lubricant. So when two rams get a little rambunctious, with each other, right, it helps kind of tone down the conflict and the tension there. And so it's not only to prevent bugs, and not only to prevent headbutts, but also cuts. A third reason for oil is because it prevents, as sheep get hurt, it brings healing to them. Now, most of their wounds come from simply living in the great outdoors, where thorns prick them, thistles hurt them, and rocks cut them. Sheep get hurt, so shepherds have to constantly inspect the sheep for cuts and abrasions because they don't want some hidden wound. They don't want today's wounds to become tomorrow's infection. And so when they find a wound, they apply oil to the wound. And here's the thing, neither does God. He doesn't want your wounds today to become infections tomorrow. You leave your wound untreated, by tomorrow, it's going to become this infection of bitterness and resentment and worry and anger. And so we, like sheep, we get wounded like all the time. And we, like sheep, have a shepherd. And Jesus, our good shepherd, will do for you what shepherds do for the sheep. He doesn't want your wounds today to become infections tomorrow. So he wants to treat them today. So how does that work? How does God treat our wounds today? Well, first of all, first you have to go to him. Now, I know that kind of seems like obvious, like, well, okay, duh, Sung. Can you come up with something more profound than you have to go to God? But let me throw this out. When is the last time you have taken your hurt, your disappointments, your heartaches, your loss, and your pains to God? Or do you try to work it out yourself? I don't know about you, but I usually try to work it out by myself. In fact, that happened just this past week, where somebody, a good friend of mine, we've been in communication for a while, we were talking about a project together, and he didn't really communicate back to me, and the result of some decision that was made just made me really, really angry. I mean, so angry. And I was livid. I was complaining to John, and I was just like, I can't believe he's such a good friend. He didn't communicate this. He didn't do this. And it's none of you. Don't worry. He lives on the other side of the state. And finally this weekend, it was just like, Amy and I were just talking about something that she was dealing with. And I finally said to her, like, oh yeah, Amy, let me tell you about this situation. And I'm complaining to her, sharing with her about all that's going on. And literally, not until this morning, this morning, as I'm walking in the door, early morning, I'm like, gosh, I don't think I've taken this situation to God himself. Right? How often do we do that? Somebody angers you, somebody hurts you, your kids or your parents say something that displeases you, and you're just like stewing in your own anger. And the last thing we do is go to God with it. So go to God. Is he your first response, or is he your last resort? When hurt and pain comes your way, we need to learn that God has to be our first response, not our last resort. And so he says, David says, you, meaning God, anoint my head with oil. Notice this. He's saying, I'm taking my hurts, my wounds, and God, I'm going to you because you anoint the oil of healing onto my heart. He doesn't say my friend, my partner, my counselor, my therapist, because they may help me in my time of need, but only God can heal me in my time of need. And so that's not saying don't go to partners and friends and counselors, but man, go to God first as your first response, not your last resort like I did this past weekend. And so go to God. May seem obvious, but it's really not. And in order to be anointed, not only do sheep need to go to the shepherd, usually the shepherd will bring them in, sheep need to learn to stand still, and they have to bow their heads and let the shepherd do the work. And so when we go to God, we don't go with demands. We come with humble hearts and high hopes. We bow our heads and surrender and let the outcome be given to the good shepherd of our lives. And so today, what we want to do as we close in a few moments, after I close in prayer, we're actually going to invite you to come forward and be anointed by oil. I'll get some instructions. Let me just pray. Let's end this time, and then we'll kind of transition to our response time, ministry time. Let's pray. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes? So God, we bring all of our little irritations and frustrations, all the negative thoughts that whirl around our heads and some that even get a foothold in our minds. Some of us, because of that, we can't sleep, or we're not eating right, and we're just going insane. And we realize now, maybe we've vented. Maybe we've shared with friends, but we've never brought them to you. So God, that's what we want to do right now. So as you're sitting in your seats, I'm giving you some time. Would you do that? Just take to God all those little flies and irritations that are in your heart and in your life, all your hurts and pains, and go to the Good Shepherd. And then we'll continue in a few moments.